1 century ago, the sky was filled with wondrous airships. This was the height of the era, the time when airships were being experimented with by the nations that had been adversaries in World War I and would become adversaries again in World War II. What were the limits of the capabilities of these airships? Was this just a temporary foray by the civilizations at the time to develop a new form of transportation? Or is there another story behind these airships? Was this some sort of technology that was rediscovered from a previous civilization? Or is it simply, as we're told in the mainstream account? Come join me today as we examine the account of airships and look for the actual explanation behind their rise and their fall.
I realize that nothing we've been doing is new. We haven't been tapping into new areas of the brain. We've just been awakening the most ancient.
Advanced airships, or the rigid airship design as it was known as. Originally they started off being called Zeppelins, and they were developed in Germany according to the official history. And yet, the other nations that contended for dominance with Germany developed their own airships, such as these designs from the United Kingdom that followed after World War I. The official history also tells us that Zeppelins were used to bomb the United Kingdom during World War I, prior to the advent of the long-range bombers that were used in World War II. And we see many interesting and intriguing designs that show the capability of these rigid airships. We don't have anything like rigid airships now today. Of course, there are other forms of airships. We think of balloons, and we of course think of the blimps that we often see in football games, such as the Goodyear blimp. But we can look and see this development timeline here of the airships from the United Kingdom, and we can see that most of their development actually started before the interwar period. And so it seems as though there was more of a, at least, sharing of technology or an awareness of this airship technology. The rigid airships were the most advanced, and they had the greatest capability of the blimps, and of course the other variations of balloons that had been around, at least since the 1700s according to the official history. And naturally we see how all these airships ended up in the United Kingdom, destroyed in trials, deleted and demolished, and as you look in the other designs, that's what you'll see. Yet, in this particular exploration, I'm going to try to showcase some images that are a little bit more rare, at least in terms of awareness. And we can see that these airships included massive hangars, other great capabilities that we often see in our explorations. There's also the many towers that have unique construction capabilities behind them that were used to moor these airships to. Perhaps the most interesting thing about airships, in addition to their all-terrain capability and their ability to move around regardless of certain situations, is where they can land or where they can moor to. This is a very interesting tower, and the building at the base of it is quite intriguing as well. What happened to all these towers? Were they all torn down? When we look at the rigid airship, though, we consider the mainstream historical account. We're informed that in the 1870s there was the initial idea to develop airships. Ah yes, another wondrous design plan that came from the 1800s, because what else would it be? Yet when you look at some of these images, you can see that there was a lot of detail that went into the construction of these airships. We have to think about the hangars, we have to consider all these materials that had to be assembled, processed, and yet at the same time, in the early 1900s to the 1930s, they managed to achieve all of this. Now, I'm not suggesting that this was impossible, just very impressive. And of course, the official history tells us why the airships had such a sudden rise to fame and popularity, and why they instantly diminished from their massive use. Would you be surprised to know that airships, or Zeppelins as they were called from Germany, provided the first transatlantic transportation? So imagine what kind of infrastructure capabilities you'd have. We'll be looking at the Graf Zeppelin later, perhaps the height of design of the rigid airship, and also the means in which it was funded. Apparently, William Randolph Hearst, who we've looked at before, was a significant proponent of airships and even provided financial support. Here we can even see one of the remaining airship hangars next to modern fighters. Something about it does seem to indicate, though, a greater advanced technology. And that's probably one of the main reasons why airships are so compelling, especially to alternative researchers. And yet, even if you accept the mainstream account of history, you have to acknowledge the fact that there was quite a lot of focus that was put into the development of the airship. Going off of the official history, with Germany developing the first airships, or Zeppelins as they called them, they seemed to understand the maximum capabilities that could be achieved with a rigid airship. There had never been any sort of flying device that could deliver munitions to another nation. And while this might be a more pernicious or violent form of use of airships, it does reflect their transportation capability. Indeed, with the construction of the Graf Zeppelin, we understand that Germany had achieved the heights of airship construction. And as part of the reparations for World War I, they even built an airship for the United States Navy, which apparently saved the Zeppelin program. This was the USS Los Angeles. So isn't this an intriguing account? We have Germany who attacked the United Kingdom, and you can find no shortage of monuments across the United Kingdom about airship attacks or Zeppelin attacks that occurred in World War I. Yet, apparently, Zeppelins were not regarded the same way that naval warships were, because after World War I, there was a lot of limitation concerning the construction of naval warships, as people feared their use. But apparently they didn't fear the Zeppelin. And so the United States and the United Kingdom decided to build or order their own Zeppelins from Germany, and then eventually improved upon their designs. At least, again, that's what the official history tells us. Of course, if you step far enough back, you have to realize that there's a lot more that goes into the construction of these impressive airships. You can see that there are no shortage of images of these vehicles being docked to towers and also being landed on the ground. And so it seems as though there's no limit to their capability. You don't have the same constraints that you do when you're operating fixed-wing aircraft or even rotary-wing aircraft. You actually have a capacity to transport logistics in a means that you can't even begin to conceptualize. Oddly enough, the interior photos of airships seem to be quite limited, and we tend to see a very austere making of the interiors, as though the crews were a little bit cramped, and we have to recall that the availability of images may or may not reflect the reality of what technological achievements that were brought about with the rigid airship. Now, we referred earlier to the blimps and the balloons and why they were limited. They didn't match the rigid airship in terms of their range and their capability to transport vast amounts of materials or logistics across vast distances. Here we can even see the construction of one of the original airships that was taken to the United States, which is how we explain there already being a U.S. logo on the side of it for the United States Navy. Very intriguing. We can also see in other images all the effort that went into the initial construction. So step back and look at this holistically. You have to establish these massive hangars that are far larger than any of the hangars that we have for current fixed-wing aircraft. And you also have to be able to assemble all these advanced construction materials. They seem to be able to quickly share the designs and the plans and the schematics and rapidly assemble these airships. Also, from the mainstream historical account, there's no shortage of apparent disasters or failures that occurred. Some airships that were destroyed by bad weather, others that had simply been crashed for any variety of reasons, and this was well before the Hindenburg, which would be the final event that would end the era of the airship. So, in the mainstream historical account, we do have examples of the airships failing, but yet the nations did not deter from actually researching and building airships. Instead, they continued to build larger and more capable airships. But is that really what happened? Or, when we look at these images, are we actually seeing another example of technology that was recovered from a previous time? And the current nations of the current civilization were attempting to press these incredible devices back into service, trying to restore them, much in the same way that we theorize that older structures were actually restored and refurbished and brought back to service. Now consider if that may be true. Then it would explain why we have this rapid rise of airships across multiple regions. If Germany was so keen on its Zeppelin technology, then even after World War I, why would they be sharing it with the Allies, or at least the nations that were their former, and in the minds of many people at the time, according to the official historical account, their current adversaries? It tends not to make a lot of sense, and yet oddly enough, it's a bit of a parallel with what happened with World War II, as the German war machine developed weapons that were very advanced, and then once the war ended, the Allied nations, or at least the nations that had been the Allies that would become NATO, and even the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations, all wanted to acquire this advanced weapons technology. It goes back to that whole story of the jet fighter. The United States Air Force was initially surprised by the jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, and yet the swept-wing design did not provide the Germans a decisive advantage. Official history tells us that they didn't have enough of them. But then the United States was surprised in the Korean War a few short years later when the MiG-15 surprised them as a swept-wing design. Ah yes, these great militaries always being so surprised. But going back to the original designs of the airship, we can see that there was a lot of effort that was put into it. You'll find these images that show these great airships operating over the wondrous cities of the land in the early 1900s. And according to the official history, the height of the airship was from the mid-1920s to the 1930s, ending with the Hindenburg disaster. A disaster that there just happened to be a camera crew there ready to film. And even though we have accounts of the other airships that failed in what seemed to be a spectacular fashion that were viewed by tens of thousands of people, this did not deter from the development. So what's really going on here? This is one of the questionable conflicting accounts that we have. Imagine what you could do, though, with the maximum capabilities of an airship. And looking at some of these advanced designs that we have, this seems to hint towards something that goes beyond what our understanding is of an airship. Now, granted, we're looking at images, and I acknowledge these images may or may not be authentic. That's always something we have to consider, because there do seem to be certain questionable aspects about them. But ultimately, I'll leave it to you to decide on the veracity of the images, as we always have to maintain a keen mind when we're doing these explorations. Do these really show these facilities that were actually discovered or rediscovered and pressed back into service that may have had these materials or these designs that were still stored within them for who knows how many of years? And we also have accounts of new materials that needed to be developed to complete the construction of these wondrous devices of transportation. So was it really what we were told with the historical development, that Germany had these great ideas in the 1870s and finally Count von Zeppelin managed to bring them about to a successful design, and then the other nations simply bought or copied the designs and then attempted to improve on them? Or is there something a lot more behind all this? That this was understood to be an advanced element of transportation technology that was now available to the Fifth Era civilization? That, like the buildings you can see in these images, that they press this technology back into service. Because you'll find, oddly enough, the association of the airship with many science fiction concepts. The ability to be able to travel without limited range and consider what other means of propulsion they may have had. There's many conflicting accounts about how fast these airships were actually able to travel. Mainstream agrees that they were limited to 60 to 80 miles per hour, and of course it depends on the wind. But we also think back to the earlier accounts of the sailing ships during the so-called Age of Discovery, and how traveling at 9 miles per hour was considered quite an achievement for these sailing ships, and yet somehow they managed to sail tens of thousands of miles over just a few short months. That's from the mainstream historical account. Looking at some of the designs, though, of the rigid airship, and what makes it very impressive is the internal functioning and also the layout. Remember that the difference between the rigid airship and the blimp is that the rigid airship actually has the skeletal construction, which then has the outer skin put around it, and then, at least according to the official historical account, is filled with hydrogen. Although they preferred to use helium, as helium was certainly not flammable or inflammable or any of the other word tricks that you use with that which can easily catch on fire. You can see, though, that there are so many images that show that these rigid airships could land anywhere. There were towers that seemed to be all over the land that had to be constructed, in addition to the hangars. And here we see the Graf Zeppelin next to the R-101, both examples of the height of rigid airship technology from Germany and the United Kingdom. And quite an impressive sight to see these two airships in the same image. The construction photos, though, are intriguing, as we oftentimes just see the skeletal examples of the hull of the rigid airships. But oftentimes we see few workers that are actually involved. There's also the matter of where were the designs for these incredible towers that seem to be all over the place. These towers that seem to be constructed just for the sole purpose of mooring an airship. Now you might ask, well, if they could just land anywhere on the ground, what would you need the towers for? Perhaps there was some other explanation for what the towers were actually used for. Or maybe we have to consider that there were so many airships that having the towers enabled you to moor several of them to the tower. Granted, it's a theory, but when you look at some of the internal schematics for what we have of airships, there seems to be a lack of understanding for what their true layout or purpose was. Indeed, we have little notes that are added and other notes that are added to try to indicate exactly what the real purpose and layout of the gondola or the control center was. I think what's most intriguing to me about airships, and I will confess that I've always had a personal interest in aviation, and whether it's fixed-wing aircraft, rotary aircraft, and of course airships, there's always the amazing capability of what flying could really provide to a civilization. You could say it ultimately frees the individual to be able to travel anywhere in the land. It also gives the capability of a civilization to rapidly transport large quantities of material, improving the infrastructure. You don't need to rely on roads. Now, of course, we do have to acknowledge what are some of the vulnerabilities with the airship. Officially, we understand that they are vulnerable to bad weather. Also, they could not travel as fast as the fixed-wing aircraft that were just in their infancy. Although I think what's most interesting to me when I did the research concerning rigid airships is the fact that they were the ones that provided the first transatlantic transportation capability. Long before Lindbergh even did his first transatlantic flight, and the great masters of aviation from the late 1920s through the 1930s achieved their feats. When you look at some other images of the components of airships, you can't help but be impressed by how advanced they appear. Here we see examples of the interior design having construction materials that seem to match some of the most capable and advanced materials that went into planes. And keep in mind what we know about fixed-wing aircraft from World War I. They were very rudimentary. They were really just a few levels beyond the gliders that the Wright brothers used with just a single propeller. And those were the mainstays of World War I. And yet during World War I and right after World War I in the interwar period, all the nations were using these rigid airships, at least all the nations that would become the primary antagonists of World War II. So was there really some sort of research effort that was being undertaken? Someone was looking for some sort of decisive advantage that they would have. And of course, we don't know the exact situation that was going on at that time. We're certainly informed of it, but it's very odd that Germany, the nation that was blamed for World War I and had to pay war reparations, was still encouraged to continue this Zeppelin development. In fact, we're even informed that Zeppelins would have died out in the 1920s if it wasn't for the sudden order by the United States for the USS Los Angeles, as the USS Los Angeles was a rigid airship that had many of the same design principles as the Graf Zeppelin. And let's explore the Graf Zeppelin, the very best design. The Graf Zeppelin is most famous for the fact that it seemed to be the most traveled of the great rigid airship designs. And you'll find no shortage of images of the Graf Zeppelin over every major and recognizable terrain across the land, such as in the United States. And the other strange thing is, according to the official account, the Graf Zeppelin, being a German Zeppelin or rigid airship, was welcomed and even funded by someone such as William Randolph Hearst. You know, when he wasn't busy building his amazing castle out there in the isolated portion of the western California coast. You can see, though, that wherever the Graf Zeppelin was, there were images taken of its immense presence and its wondrous inspiration over the great terrain features or incredible structures that reflect an entirely different existence. And people often wonder why alternative researchers can get the idea that these rigid airships reflected a very different time. When you see these images with these old world buildings, it almost gives us the impression that this was a completely different world, that this was a time that never really existed in the manner that we were told. Now, perhaps that's just simply a coincidence of appearances, and it's also just another coincidence that the images of these great airships over these old world cities happen to inspire other science fiction tales. Or perhaps there's an entirely different account that we might not be aware of. Concerning the Graf Zeppelin, we understand its wondrous capabilities and its ability to transit the entire world. We're informed that, according to the mainstream account, the Graf Zeppelin was the first aircraft that did a round-the-world trip. Now, again, this was due to funding and the sale of special stamps, apparently. It was also because of the support of William Randolph Hearst and other individuals. Why exactly would these individuals from the United States be so keen on supporting this transportation capability, this unique design that came from a rival nation? And even during the period of the Weimar Republic, that was the government that Germany had after the end of World War I, before the rise of the National Socialist Workers' Party in the 1930s, why would these nations be willing to fund this device? And you can see there are some images that show us some of the opulence and amazing luxury that was available on the Graf Zeppelin, and subsequently the Hindenburg. Now, the Graf Zeppelin was the largest rigid airship of its time, and the Hindenburg exceeded it. But the Graf Zeppelin is most famous because it had the greatest achievements, flying around the world or across the lands, however you want to look at it, and even committing a polar flight. All very impressive. Why is it that the nations turned away from these airship designs if they knew that the answer was helium? Because the Hindenburg disaster simply revolved around the use of hydrogen, which, unfortunately, was prone to failure, or at least quite a difficult situation with fire. Looking at the round-the-world flight, we have conflicting accounts between how long this flight took. Officially, it was 22 days, but there are other accounts that say that the flight occurred in a much shorter amount of time. Now, I wasn't there, I don't know for sure, but even at the 22 days figure, the fact that this was the first aircraft, any form of aircraft, that managed to complete a round-the-world or across-the-lands flight is very impressive. And that's probably the most interesting element of the Graf Zeppelin, is the fact that it went everywhere and anywhere. And again, here in the Soviet Union, where the Graf Zeppelin operated out of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, and Archangel, all the way up on its little polar expedition. Apparently, all the former adversarial nations to Germany decided to support the development and use of this incredible Zeppelin. And is it just because everybody was utterly enamored with the technology? The polar journey of the Graf Zeppelin is intriguing in and of itself, as it involved meeting up with an individual on site to showcase the capabilities of the Graf Zeppelin. And perhaps that's one of the most alluring details that we have about these rigid airships, is that they could go anywhere. We have an account of the Graf Zeppelin going anywhere, such as linking up with this Norwegian explorer who bears a striking resemblance to Mark Hamill from the film Slipstream. There were even other airships that were actually employed to support this journey, and earlier airship journeys that actually enabled the explorers to finally reach the North Pole. So isn't it interesting how even in the mainstream account, the use of airships and their capabilities finally allowed people to reach areas that they had never reached before? And it was as though the Graf Zeppelin was merely a culmination of this developing technology. But was it? Or was this a technology that was already well known and was simply being tested to see what the limits of its capabilities were? Was the Graf Zeppelin really flying around the world just to show that it could be done? Was it really flying up to the Arctic just to show that it could be done? Or was there some other intention behind this? Was this really truly the unlimited range mission that only a rigid airship could undertake, to really explore the very limits of the land? Oddly enough, we're supposed to believe that Captain Cook was the one who defined the limits of the land, even though he missed discovering the entire Antarctic continent. Well, if you have a rigid airship, you can go anywhere. You can explore anything. You have no limitations on your range. And ultimately, if you can build a larger one, if you can lay it out with all of the needs and requirements of the crew and the passengers, you really have an airship that could go anywhere. And the Graf Zeppelin proved that it could be done. And amazingly enough, it managed to complete all these achievements without any sort of disaster. Now, they certainly ran into difficulties. After all of these incredible achievements, though, the Graf Zeppelin finally met its untimely demise when, after the destruction of the Hindenburg, it was simply forgotten and scrapped, to be used by a regime that would go on to conduct World War II. And thus the great achievements of the Graf Zeppelin seem to have been lost to history in many ways. Yet there was a time when this was, according to the mainstream account even, the pioneering advent of the capability of what we could do in the air. And it's probably one of the reasons why this continues to be an alluring account for us of what the rigid airship could do. You couldn't do this with a blimp, you couldn't do this with a balloon. But yet, what was the true time that the Graf Zeppelin managed to travel, whether it was across the lands or up on its polar expedition? People will claim that they know the exact times, and maybe they are correct. But there are other accounts that say otherwise. And let's look at the future or past, but not the present. So the account that airships could provide wondrous transportation capabilities in the future. We have seen articles that allude to the revival of the airship or a great renaissance in the use of the rigid airship and other means of powering them. We also have the visualization of how airships, according to the official history, have inspired science fiction or even the steampunk genres. Great fleets of airships that went across the sky, and perhaps they utilized other means of managing to defy whatever the pull is from the ground, whether you consider it gravity or something else. We even have this wondrous image of something such as the Eiffel Tower that might have been a great mooring post for airships. And suddenly the construction of the Eiffel Tower makes a lot more sense as something that had an applicable use to support transportation, and not merely as a wondrous showcasing trinket for yet another World's Fair. How far could they have gone with these advanced designs of these airships? Would they even be considered airships at all? Perhaps that's the only way to refer to them as. Did they have some other means of propulsion and some other means of sustaining their altitude in the air? Was it always helium and hydrogen that were used, or were there other means that could have been used to keep these very impressive and colossal devices in the air? Or is this just simply the realm of science fiction, simply imagination that's gone too far? It is intriguing to think of the fact, though, that there were actual achievements of airships, and you can find no shortage of photos that show people walking into the actual hull of a rigid airship from one of the mooring towers. And so this does give us the impression that there were many capabilities that perhaps were simply not shared with us. Now, I'm not suggesting that there was some sort of intentional effort not to share the true capabilities of airships, but if we had nations that knew or had an idea that they were going to be involved in another worldwide or global conflict, as it were, soon, then perhaps they simply had a good reason to keep all of their classified documents secret. I mean, it makes total sense. You just buy your airship and you employ it and you refine it. Such as this very impressive design that shows the use of airship in terms of even carrying aircraft. And there were even airships that were aircraft carriers that the United States attempted to use. And of course, both of them wrecked in bad weather or very questionable conditions. Consider what a civilization could do if it had airships that had no limits in terms of their range and their carrying capacity. What kind of materials could you transport where and when? Does this suddenly explain one of the means in which the previous civilization could have achieved its wondrous constructions of great buildings and structures across the land? Is it also another more elaborate form of infrastructure and transportation when you have advanced capacities on the ground taken in tandem with these incredible airships and what they could have achieved? This is probably the most alluring exploration when it comes to considering what the limits on this exploration were. And finally, what could we do if we had our own airship? If everybody had their own rigid version of the airship that they could explore anywhere in the land without a limit on range or capacity? Suddenly, it completely turns around everything from our understanding of the limits of technology. There's also the question that we have to ask is, why would the great nations of the land after World War II suddenly want to abandon the practicality of the rigid airship, the ability to continue to develop something that would defy the limitations of transportation at that time? Now, of course, we'll get the usual slew of explanations that it just simply wasn't in their best interest to do so, and that may be true. They simply opted to pursue the fixed-wing aircraft and the very large cargo aircraft capacities that we have. And yet you'll find no shortage of images. You'll find no shortage of ideas that go all the way back from the time of Jules Verne, which give us the idea that airships perhaps provided an entirely different form of existence, a more liberated form of the ability to travel, and not just to travel, but also to transport materials from one point to another. It doesn't matter what kind of terrain that you actually have, whether it's mountains or flatlands or even the coastal areas. You can transport anywhere at any point in time. And it may simply be speculation in terms of how far the capability of these airships actually evolved to. Yet, once again, there's no shortage that we have, much like with the buildings, that show that there are many different sketches, many different plans and ideas for how airships could have been used, such as this much larger airship that features an entire hospital on the top of it. You suddenly have the ability to have that truly mobile hospital, and you have all the capacity and capability that you need. Now, expand this to other ideas, other forms of civilization or a society that's no longer limited by time or space or range. Then you suddenly see the true potential of the rigid airship, the once more advanced design. But what are your thoughts? Was this a device from a previous civilization, or is the mainstream account correct? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
The presence of the others, non-human beings that we come across in our explorations. And what are these? We begin by looking at the Plague Doctor. Now, according to official history, the Plague Doctor was merely a response by the civilization, the societies of the so-called Middle Ages, to respond to the recurring occurrences of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as they called it. The purpose behind the Plague Doctor was this was some individual who was not a fully trained doctor or was even considered a charlatan, who was contracted by the state to actually help people deal with the plague. Although, in reality, according to official historical accounts, they really didn't help anybody deal with anything. In fact, the only purpose they served with facilitating the government tracking the plague was designating who had actually contracted the plague and who had died from it. So again, another account of a previous government keeping track of who was alive and who was dead, and yet we still have questionable population counts. So, the Plague Doctor was not effective in responding to the plague. It should also be noted that the actual costume came a couple centuries after the original occurrence of the bubonic plague in the 1300s, or however you want to think of the official historical timeline. There's a very disturbing psychological effect with this character. And indeed, from official historical accounts at the time, we often have an almost inhuman appearance to it. And it's this recurring theme of the inhuman appearance that we have to question, is there something more behind this Plague Doctor? For example, we notice the details in the hands. Very inhuman hands that are often displayed with long nails or something that seems to be some sort of predatory creature. There's always the bird-like mask, and yet we can't ignore the fact that there's even a depiction from Native American lore that matches something that looks like the Plague Doctor. Is this merely a coincidence? Or is this also a profound psychological fear that endured in Native American mythology? To this day, we can see this individual that looks just like the Plague Doctor bird mask. Very strange and frightening creature. And yet when we look closely, we see that it's displayed with the same bizarre inhuman hands, with the long claws. So what are we really looking at with this Plague Doctor? Is this really just some human being who wore a bird mask to have pleasant-smelling things within the mask to protect them from the plague? At least that's what the mainstream tells us. It's always interesting how we have these conflicting accounts in terms of the capability of the denizens of a particular time period. And yet the Plague Doctor is no exception. Simply have pleasant-smelling things, and it'll protect you from the plague, the terrifying scourge of the bubonic death that had completely overwhelmed Europe and returned in subsequent centuries. Again, that's what the mainstream historical account says. But we consider the psychological and profound terror that would accompany this mask. Why would any government or religious authority at that time, as we're informed Europe especially had, allow this or condone it? It's almost as though they were trying to terrify their population if this is indeed what happened. Or was this really representing something else? A creature that was not human. A creature that may have once been human but was transformed. Or perhaps some sort of other creature. Certainly not human at all from its inception. And when we compare and contrast the accounts we have of the plague doctors from Europe to some of the accounts of the Native American mythology, these are questions we have to ask, because these consistencies are a little too common to simply be ignored and dismissed as mere coincidence. When you look closer at the plague doctor, though, you start to understand the psychological effect it has, imagining what may actually be under that mask. What if it's not human at all? What if you're actually looking at some sort of terrifying bird or predatory creature? Something that you could even say resembles a Skeksis from the Dark Crystal franchise. And indeed, you have other images that give the display of the pointed teeth and the predatory tongue that's often displayed from what creatures might actually be under these plague doctor masks. And we have a completely different consideration, a completely different series of events that may have transpired, that these masks, these almost chemical protective suits, were actually concealing a very horrific and terrifying creature underneath it, that for some reason the civilizations at that time continued to remember it, and always the profound psychological effect. Because we have to ask, if the plague doctor was not some sort of terrifying creature, why would the authorities at the time actually have their doctors dress up with such a mentality to terrify the population? Unless in reality they were these creatures, and they were simply concealing themselves so they could operate within the population, to do whatever terrifying thing that they were going to do. And we have a good idea of what that was, because what persists with the rumors of these plague doctors or these terrifying creatures is they were indeed predatory. The population in its collective conscience remembers that death accompanied these creatures wherever they showed up. And it was not merely a coincidence. It's something that was remembered and recorded, and you can find no shortage of examples, not just in European historical accounts, but also in the mythologies of many Native American tribes, at how terrifying and horrific these creatures really were. What sort of powers did they have? And why is it that they still endure in our memory to this day? The terrifying implications of seeing the appearance of whatever creature may have really existed under the costume of the plague doctor. And now we go to the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. Oftentimes the whole aspect of aliens is dismissed as being absurd and ludicrous, and yet we have this account of the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins, not necessarily aliens, and this occurred in the town of Kelly near Hopkinsville in Kentucky, not very far from Fort Campbell in Tennessee, a major U.S. Army base where the 101st Airborne Division is based. And in the encounter at the isolated Sutton farmhouse, we have an account of these terrifying little goblins that just showed up on this farmhouse. What's a little bit more interesting, though, about this account compared to the usual so-called alien contact accounts is that there seem to be elements of it that are more real. For example, there's no accounts of any missing time. We merely had this unfortunate family in this isolated farm in Kentucky that suddenly encountered these goblins, these creatures that were prowling about their farm. And this, of course, invokes the terror with this account. It should also be noted that local authorities, which did include members of the 101st Airborne Division, did arrive to respond to this incident after this family was terrified through a night by these goblins and tried to fend them off by using firearms. Naturally, the firearms were not effective against these horrific entities, these goblins, or these aliens, whatever you really want to think of them as. And yet the incident afterwards was well documented, of the family being terrorized in their own house by these horrific goblins. Repeated attempts to fend them off with firearms were ineffective, and the goblins continued to terrorize the family within and in the exterior of their house and their farm. It should be noted that when the authorities arrived on the scene, they took this account very seriously, and they did notice that the family seemed to be in a state of utter terror and panic, as though they really had endured some sort of event that had challenged their psychological well-being. And one could certainly understand why the presence of ghoulish creatures that are impervious to firearms could inflict such terror on people that they would never forget it. And I think that's one of the elements of this particular account that gives it a little bit more credibility. Of course, we could easily dismiss this account as the product of fantastical imaginations, but the fact that the authorities did respond and did document that this family was psychologically traumatized gives it a little more credibility. It should also be noted that this encounter very nearly inspired a certain filmmaker to make a film about terrifying aliens. Of course, he changed it to more of a cute alien that we recall as E.T. The event was also documented in local media at the time. On this farm in Kelly, Kentucky, where the story of a spaceship and 12 little men showed up on the farm terrorizing the family, and that the firearms were indeed ineffective defending them off. What was really going on? What were these creatures? Were these aliens, as we might like to think, or were these some other extraterrestrial entities beyond which we understand? Or was this some sort of cryptid, some sort of undocumented animal that happened to be existing near this farm? Or was it simply the product of mass hallucination and everyone panicking had caused the family to go into this panic state because they thought they viewed something that was not really there? And when the authorities arrived, therefore they documented it as though it was an event where the family was psychologically traumatized, but it was merely the product of their own crazed imaginations. It should be noted, though, that there is a very profound psychological effect to intrusions within your own property, your own residence. So we could certainly understand why the profound psychological effect could inspire the imagination to hallucinate a little bit. But for whatever reason, there seems to be some more consistencies behind this. Although some would state that it's merely a desire of the state of Kentucky to simply bring about more tourism by pushing this particular area and having people come in to explore the lands that were involved in the great Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter. Yet, oddly enough, in subsequent events and investigations, there never seemed to be many inconsistencies with the accounts that were given, and no one in the family ever retracted their account as being official. Now, I'm sure if you look a little deeper, you might find potential retractions and changes, or the story going back and forth. But it is a very terrifying and almost realistic seeming story. What were these goblins if they did in fact exist? Where did they come from? And what was their true intention? Based on the events that the family reported, they just seemed to be curious above all else. And it really was stating the word probing. Probing is a military procedure, or conducting reconnaissance, trying to learn about a particular area. And there might be a follow-on force that's going to follow probing. These are some of the sketches of the creatures, or the goblins, or the entities, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that were cataloged by one of the members of the 101st Airborne when they showed up to investigate this event. Some local authorities even suggested that perhaps the family had misidentified our good friend the owl as these horrific entities. Yes, indeed. And I've certainly encountered a lot of bulletproof owls in my life as well. They're beautiful animals, but somehow I don't believe that these were owls. Either this was some sort of massive psychological aberration for the family, or there was a little bit more to this account. There is a troubling and unsettling element of realism. The fact that this remains a quote-unquote well-documented account, and the fact that no one was ever able to dismiss or disprove this. The actual occurrence of creatures showing up in our home or our isolated residence is a recurring terror that we face. So, do these creatures represent something that are real? Do they have some other explanation? Let's look at the accounts that we have of cryptids, monsters, and demons. One of the most well-known that we have tends to be the Jersey Devil, operating in the Pine Barrens Forest in New Jersey. And there have been many different films and books that explore the account of the legend of the birth of this creature, involving elements of witchcraft and myth and several different origin stories, although there tend to be a few agreed upon. The Jersey Devil represents the classic cryptid, a very disgusting and horrific creature that exists in contravention of all known rules of life. And yet there have been several documented sightings of this creature, some images even being purported to be real. Although, of course, we know that with our ability to generate images, this doesn't necessarily prove anything. And again, this could be another example of some sort of psychological aberration. But what interests me is that we have so many different historical accounts, or things that are well documented, that allude to the existence of this terrifying creature, this Jersey Devil. There's also the really strange element of the psychological effects that seem to accompany this creature wherever it exists, or if it does in fact exist. Is this merely the product of the tales impacting the human mind, and suddenly it becomes yet another version of mass hysteria? Well, perhaps the thing we should be most concerned about then is how easily influenced the human mind can be, and perhaps how easily influenced the mind can be in large groups, if that's indeed what we're seeing here as the mainstream wants us to believe, that none of these creatures really exist, and that people are just simply susceptible to, how shall we say, suggestion. But oddly enough, there do seem to be more details behind certain cryptids and creatures such as the Jersey Devil, whether it's the description of its actual being, or some of its terrifying personal habits that it has. What does it hunt? And why does it have such an element of terror to it? Is it possible that such a creature could really exist? We've oftentimes dismissed the other creatures that we said could never exist, and yet we're often surprised at what our mainstream and official accounts tell us about what existed in the distant past, whether it's large creatures or terrifying creatures. This is what the Jersey Devil allegedly looks like, and this is its scale to an actual human. Now, is it true to some of the mythological accounts that the Jersey Devil was the product of some sort of witchcraft, some sort of spell, or maybe even some sort of dark alchemy, if you will? Some sort of experiment that we think about with the homunculus example, that may have gone wrong and transformed either some sort of unfortunate creature or human being into something else. Once again, this will simply be dismissed as fantastical accounts or simply searching for possibilities when there are none. It should also be noted that one of the most interesting films made about the Jersey Devil was Exploring for the Jersey Devil, called The Last Broadcast. It set the stage for the found footage films, although this one is a little unique, and it did precede the more famous and well-known Blair Witch film. The other interesting element about this film is it talks about the profound psychological impact on certain individuals. And unlike the Blair Witch, we do actually find out who's behind the killings in this film. And we do find out where the real terror lies. It's within the human heart, or the human soul, or however you want to view it. And perhaps that's the real terror that we have. Other cryptids that we consider are the Mothman from West Virginia. And the Mothman has several different accounts behind it that seem to give it a little bit more realism than we might like to think. Accounts of something being in post-World War II munitions plants, a creature that was roving around there that terrorized several teens as they were driving in their car. There's even an account of a couple teens trying to escape this creature, driving at speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour, and the creature was easily keeping up as it flew. There's also the accounts of the Mothman that say that it would be a portent of doom. Of course, there's always signs and portents that seems to accompany these creatures, whether it's a bridge collapse or some other great calamity that occurs in a particular area. There's many myths that actually come about from Appalachia where this Mothman was sighted, and many of these myths include other accounts of cryptids. Is there again something more to this, or once again is this a mass psychological aberration? Is this again some sort of creature that may have existed in the distant past, and yet some surviving examples of it, for whatever reason, continue to inhabit the wilderness that are not easily seen? Or again, is it just something that we could easily dismiss as some sort of psychological aberration? Our mainstream adherents will dismiss this as merely the product of pseudoscience, and indeed they try to categorize these sightings as the adherents of pseudoscience simply trying to push a meaning that these are aliens or some other strange cryptid creatures that have never been seen. What I find particularly interesting, though, is in this age of the internet and shared information, that we have such a variety of creatures that are seen all over the land. We don't have people reporting Mothman sightings all over every single continent. We have unique creatures that seem to be confined to unique regions. Now, once again, I'm sure that our mainstream skeptics or skeptoids will tell us that this is merely the product of localized mass hysteria. We also consider the account of the Wendigo, a Native American mythological terror. The Wendigo is quite fascinating because of the fact that it was a spirit, and yet there are diverging accounts that it was either some sort of horrific, monstrous creature, or a spirit that would possess a human being, causing it to engage in cannibalistic tendencies. Indeed, the terror behind these creatures is that they would actually feed exclusively on human flesh. And I've always given a little bit more variety and understanding, along with authenticity, to some of the Native American mythological accounts. They had to go through surviving a lot of factors of the reset to include the reservation in the American education system, and yet they managed to retain many of their myths and their legends, which do seem to have a little bit more in terms of legitimacy to them, especially given the fact that there are numerous Native Americans that will not speak of creatures such as these. The Wendigo is terrifying, though, because of its existential nature of threatening the very flesh of human beings. There's also accounts of the fact that it did persist across the land, and it's such a very powerful memory. And again, it goes back to questioning the whole fact that we have such a vast array and variety of creatures that are seen across the land. So, again, is this merely the product of old myth, old legend that's very regionalized and localized, and we don't see it everywhere? Or is there something that's truly authentic to the presence or the possible presence of these creatures that are very clearly non-human, or perhaps an even more disturbing possibility that these creatures were once human that were transformed into something that were no longer human by some process that we no longer understand? Indeed, when we look at many of the mythological accounts, the legend, whether we're talking about one of the cryptids, the Wendigo, or even the Plague Doctor, there seem to be accounts that do give a disturbing possibility of what these creatures could possibly afflict in terms of terror on a human population. And this is where we start to see the connections from our other previous explorations when we look at the fall of previous civilizations. We do seem to have it in our collective memory that there were creatures that were quite terrifying, creatures that had tremendous psychological, physical, and even spiritual capabilities to attack and destroy the very welfare, the very fabric of human civilizations in the past. Imagine a vast army or array of such creatures like this, different types of creatures in different areas that had these extended capabilities. Now, once again, I'm sure the adherents of the mainstream would dismiss such a notion as the product of pseudoscience or just simply a wild imagination. Although, I'm always interested in the fact that we also want to say that there were wondrous and fantastical creatures that did officially exist in the distant past. So why is it some creatures could exist and other creatures cannot? Well, you simply need to turn to someone in authority, someone who has been through the academic system, and they will give you an honest answer. And the last thing you should ever do is trust what you see with your own eyes, or certainly do not come to your own conclusions. But when we look at the mythological terrors that many of these creatures represent, and we see the fact that they endure within our fear in the back of our mind to this day, we can see that there is indeed a lingering and profound psychological effect behind them. And whatever the actual story behind these creatures, if they're simply truly the product of our minds, or do they represent something that did exist and did terrorize us in the past? We also have to ask the question in terms of how long ago this was in the past. It should be noted that the Native Americans do not speak of many of the terrifying elements of their mythology. And whether it's a skinwalker, a Wendigo, or whatever, and there's certainly no shortage of different creatures that appear in Native American mythology that are quite threatening and terrifying, we do have to remember there does seem to be an element of realism to them, in the fact of the impact of the psychological terror that people do not speak of them. Are these creatures simply the product of our nightmares and we simply record them to terrorize others for entertainment purposes? Or is there something behind them that does reflect something that genuinely happened in the past? A memory, if you will, that's locked in our minds. Were these just UFOs or lights, or do they represent something else? We do have many accounts of strange anomalies that do not make a lot of sense, and oftentimes people will go to extreme levels to dismiss anything which is seen and reported. And it's quite fascinating. Yet the same accounts could be used or subverted for misinformation purposes. So we always have to remain cautious and keep open minds and actually come to our own conclusions. We see that there is definitely a theme to make the whole concept of exploring topics such as this ridiculous and absurd. And certain skeptoids and people will tell us that we shouldn't even be considering this. Yet when we go about the land, we do see very interesting remnants of what may have been in the past. We do see odd objects that defy simple explanation. And we do have accounts, even when we look at our official and certified historical account, that simply do not make a lot of sense. So what's the real explanation behind these others, these non-human beings? What were they, and where did they fall in our 5 eras possible timeline? Perhaps the plague doctors really were some sort of terrifying creature that was contrived or created in the distant past using some sort of dark alchemical processes. These were creatures that existed between the resets, and they were unleashed on the population to bring about control. And that's why we still have this mentality of death that accompanies the plague doctors. The cryptids could have been other creatures from even before in the past. A few surviving examples that are still dotted across the land. Of course, it could simply be the product of our imagination, and for some reason these legends endure and people are just simply into entertainment. So simply watch the news and don't question anything, and allow yourself to be told what to think and what's important every day. You certainly have that option. But the plague doctor is something that intrigues me because we're informed that this was a response to the plague at the time. Yet these were the same people who managed to construct the Florence Cathedral. And it should be noted that the Florence Cathedral in Florence, Italy was constructed prior to the Renaissance, and they didn't need an industrial revolution to do it. Of course, we can simply wave it off with our usual intellectual cheetah flips of explaining what happened in the past. But what do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me. Watching a sailing ship with a modern city in the background displays to us just how far we've come in technology. We have to realize that now we have a global positioning system and various other implements that aid us in our navigation in the seas. And yet in the distant past, the sailing ships relied on very rudimentary instrumentation to ascertain their position. They were lost amongst 139 million square miles of oceans across the land. How was it they managed to pinpoint their position and navigate? We also have to realize that through our explorations, we've seen many incomplete maps of the land that they utilized in their navigations. We were always touched by the amazing bravery that these ancient mariners showed by exploring lands that they didn't know, facing great terrors that they couldn't possibly imagine. And yet, these were the individuals that history informs us enabled us to map and understand the extent of our lands, our realm, or our world, however you want to look at it. Today we're going to examine their account and determine exactly what transpired when it came about to understanding our world and mapping it and understanding the nature of the land when we explore the very depths of the age of discovery.
Savior, did he have a gauntlet of steel?
Why, yes. Do you know him?
Aye, all too well, damn his heart.
In order to really evaluate the age of discovery, we have to understand what the baseline of maps were available. And we go back to Greece with Aristophanes, an individual who was another one of those polymaths. And Aristophanes actually knew that the Earth was round, or a sphere. He calculated the circumference. And yet, for some unknown reason, the map that he provided omitted about 70% of the surface area. Now, of course, there's a better question in how could we actually have any of the works of Aristophanes, his maps, his books, because they were all lost, because as the chief librarian of Alexandria, we know what happened to the Library of Alexandria. It was destroyed. Yet somehow, knowledge of his works persevered. Perhaps it was similar to the Goonies story, where one of his acolytes must have survived and brought the knowledge of his experiment, which actually involved measuring shadows at different points on the surface during the solstice of the Earth, and that was how he managed to calculate the circumference. Yet for some reason, when they put his maps back together in the 19th century or the 1800s, because when else would it have happened, they didn't actually have all the continents. It only showed 3 of the continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Old World, and it completely omitted the Americas, Australia, Antarctica, most of the Atlantic, and then of course the Pacific Ocean, only the largest ocean in the land. So these baseline maps that mariners had during the time that we think of as the Middle Ages were lacking. They didn't show all of the land. We also have to look at the original sailing ships that they had, and we think of these as very rudimentary designs. They relied exclusively on wind power and rudder. and very limited instrumentation to determine their position, whether it was the baseline sextants, and yet we have conflicting accounts that indicate that they did have more accurate and adequate instrumentation available. It's rather strange. Officially, according to mainstream history, the construction of ships evolved and they became more seaworthy. They became more capable of being provisioned to conduct these long voyages of exploration, whether they lasted months or even years. And in fact, this culminated with the discovery of the Americas and the exploration of all the world as we think of it by these explorers. And of course, ending with the story of the Pilgrims settling in North America, although that was after the colony of Jamestown. What of the official history, though? To understand the original voyages of exploration, we go back to the land route, from the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. Marco Polo paralleled many of the routes of the Silk Road, and was one of the first Europeans, at least one of the first published Europeans, to travel to the land of Cathay, or what we think of as China, and the Great Khanate at the time. There was a wonderful miniseries where actor Ken Marshall, and frequent viewers of this channel recognize him as the actor who portrayed Prince Colwyn in this particular viewer's favorite film, Kroll. It's a pretty good miniseries, and even if the history on it seems a little questionable, and indeed mainstream historians do argue on the veracity of Marco Polo's journeys, because of the fact that they didn't have a printing press when they reproduced it, so there's a lot of discrepancies within his account. But it is generally agreed upon by scholars that Marco Polo was the first European who had a well-documented travel to what we think of as China, and even the area that we associate on certain maps that's called Tartaria. Of course, we're informed that's Greater Tartaria. And here we have an image of Marco Polo dressed almost like a Circassian. Of course, they'll tell us that he's a Tartar. Maybe it's the same thing. The other baseline maps, though, show that there seemed to be a real lack of awareness in the actual layout of the lands, or how the continents were shaped, what the actual distance was. And these were the struggles that many of these early maritime explorers faced. They had no idea where they were going. It really was exploration. It's even more impressive when you think of some of the other, how shall we say, native explorers, such as the Polynesians. We're informed that they didn't have any instrumentation whatsoever when they were rolling about the South Pacific on their canoes, just happening to find islands in the middle of nowhere in a vast Pacific Ocean, simply relying on the navigation of stars. We also think of the first circumnavigation officially of the planet, the globe, which, remember, Eratosthenes proved, by Ferdinand Magellan. And Ferdinand Magellan was actually a Portuguese navigator who was sponsored by Spain to conduct this expedition. And by fortune and happenstance, he happened to sail around the land, finding the Strait of Magellan and bypassing from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Although it should be noted that Ferdinand Magellan was rather surprised because he thought it would only take 3 days once they sailed through the Strait of Magellan to actually come upon Asia. And instead it took them well over 3 months, in which many members of his crew died. But who exactly needs a crew on a series of sailing ships? Because apparently you can just do it yourself. And when you have the sense of adventurism that Ferdinand Magellan did, and also the will and leadership, you don't need a crew. Perhaps he was lacking Eratosthenes' map to really understand what the nature of the land was. Or maybe he had a copy, and of course it didn't show the other continents and was missing the Pacific Ocean. What makes more sense to you? For whatever reason, Magellan is the one who's remembered as the person who completed the first circumnavigation of the land, the world. But he didn't actually survive. He was killed during a conflict in the Philippines, foreshadowing the fate of a later explorer, Captain Cook, when he had a hostile encounter with natives. Quite interesting how many times this story repeats when it comes to explorers. We don't exactly know how Ferdinand Magellan died. They allegedly have an account of how he died and how he was overwhelmed by the power of the natives, and what remained of his crew had to complete the circumnavigation. So Ferdinand Magellan was not actually the individual that completed the navigation, even though we're told what a stellar leader he was, and even to this day in the Philippines, they very well mark and provide monuments for the area where this encounter occurred. The Philippines view it as a retention of their independence, and then the Spanish also review Ferdinand Magellan as a hero, even if he was Portuguese. So I guess that just goes to show you that the Spanish were willing to recognize a great adventurer and leader, even if he was from another nation. And look at this very fine, monumental, triumphal arch that they erected in memory of Ferdinand Magellan. So you can certainly see that it was a display of international amity on part of the Spanish. But even more interesting is the individual who actually completed the circumnavigation of the land after Ferdinand Magellan was killed. This is Spanish navigator Juan Sebastian Elcano, and he was the one who actually completed the circumnavigation of the land. Perhaps he's the one who had the full, unadulterated copy of Eratosthenes' map, going with the Carl Sagan pronunciation now of the name. But it's very intriguing to think of all of the things that were discovered, namely the crops that we consider New World crops, such as corn, tomatoes, and potatoes, all of which would play a significant role in the unfolding of historical events, whether it was with a famine or the availability and sustenance of the new colonies that were going to be established. So many different events and so many attempts at exploration to really find different routes from both the Philippines to Mexico, or New Spain as they called it at that time. And many of these expeditions were failures, namely because of the fact that officially there was no Panama Canal in existence at that time. The only way to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic and vice versa was to sail through the Strait of Magellan, or go around the Cape Horn, which is a very treacherous passage, and continues to be to this day. Although with modern sailing implementations and instrumentation, one would think it would be a more simplistic matter. There's also the fact that we have established sea lanes in several of these areas, and there are ships that travel. It's also interesting to consider the age of exploration concerns the Russian explorations into Siberia. And it is very well documented that Russian explorers pushed eastward using the river system to explore the great unknown frontier of Siberia. It's another very intriguing aspect when we consider all the areas that are the new lands of the New World were discovered, and quite recently according to the official history, because most of these areas we're told were discovered, explored, and mapped from 1500 onward. Most of them are 500 years old or newer. Now, of course, we don't want to overlook the indigenous populations that already existed within these lands, and yet, once again, it's another conflicting account. Because we have many of these survival stories where we have these explorers going to exotic areas and mapping out areas of the land that had never been seen before and encountering terrifying things such as polar bears and other horrifying necessities of life. And yet, oddly enough, we also see very well developed and architectural wonders when we look at some of the paintings and the drawings of what was available in Russia and even Siberia at that time when they began their explorations. We'll be coming back to doing exploration specifically on the land route explorations of Siberia because it's quite interesting. And it should be noted that even Russia and Siberia to this day do not escape the modern miracle of architecture and construction. Why, this could be a Holiday Inn anywhere in the United States, or an apartment building. So once again, you can see that the majesty of the current era pervades across the land. But the explorations are interesting when we consider what the sailors really endured. We, of course, have the story of Christopher Columbus, and yet another series of unfortunate Spaniard explorers who are overlooked in the roles that they played with these discoveries. And then there's also the baffling view of Columbus that persists to this day. We even have the mixed account of the concept of Thanksgiving, when the Pilgrims worked so well with the Native Americans and they shared a bountiful harvest. Of course, we're told that many elements of this story are simply myth or fantastical. So once again, it becomes difficult to ascertain exactly what the real history is and what isn't. And let's look at Captain Cook, who explored the Pacific. And so after all these centuries of exploration from the 1400s to the 1600s, we finally come to the end of the era of exploration with Captain Cook. Captain Cook was a British explorer in the 1700s who had earned his initial commission in the Royal Navy and even earned his reputation by being a wonderful cartographer, a navigator. He was someone who played an essential role in the 7 Years' War, or as it's known in North America, the French-Indian War, in which the British managed to overcome the French to obtain greater colonial possessions. It was considered to be quite an interesting career development for Captain Cook, and interestingly enough, we have many different depictions and displays of Captain Cook. Some even present more of a heroic Horatio Hornblower image. Why, here we have Captain Cook, or the James T. Kirk version of Captain Cook. But it should be noted that there are many different versions of Captain Cook, and of course, we didn't actually have a photograph of him because photography hadn't been invented. But we have many different interpretations of what he may have looked like, such as Harvey Keitel here, the Harvey Keitel version of Captain Cook. Very interesting that there are many different ways to look at this famed British explorer who was the one who helped the British win the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War being a very interesting conflict itself, as many state it was one of the first world wars, and indeed, given the geographical extent of this conflict, we could certainly believe that, especially with the way Prussia was fighting many different nations at the same time, and of course the battles between Great Britain and France. Oddly enough, many places that Captain Cook went to still have monuments to this day. And the role that Captain Cook played was in the siege of Louisbourg, and then subsequently in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Captain Cook was exceptional with his ability at cartography and navigation, and indeed some of his maps are stated to have still been used as late as the 1950s until they were replaced. Looking at the fortress of Louisbourg, we see the traditional fortress that seems to be very well constructed. And yet, during the 7 Years' War, the seizure of this fortress was decisive, especially for the continued British campaign to eventually seize Quebec and ultimately bring about a successful conclusion to the war against France. Oddly enough, when we look at these sort of facilities and we see what we're told are impenetrable defenses, oftentimes the Star Fort formation, we're touched by the fact that they never seem to be successful. So perhaps they were already obsolete at the time of their construction. Or perhaps there were more innovative military minds than the engineers at that time. Who knows what the true explanation is? But Captain Cook made a name for himself by properly navigating and mapping out the St. Lawrence. The St. Lawrence, which was used during the subsequent campaign against the French army by the British army, led by General Wolfe. Now, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham was a British victory where apparently the British army used innovative tactics. Although early in the war, the British army was known to struggle quite a bit against the French army, such as with the seizure and surrender of Fort William Henry. Indeed, the French commander that facilitated that surrender and British defeat also died in this battle, Marquis de Montcalm. He's featured quite prominently in the film Last of the Mohicans. So many interesting details with the 7 Years' War, and this was the conflict where Captain James Cook made a name for himself. And of course, because of his service during this conflict with the Royal Navy, he was naturally given a position of greater authority. And here we see the most famous painting, or the Julian Glover version of Captain James Cook. Yes, imagine if they had British actor Julian Glover to portray James Cook in some sort of miniseries in the 1980s. Maybe it happened in some sort of alternative reality. Whatever the situation, though, James Cook was set about on a series of exploration missions to really map out that great unexplored portion of the Earth as it was at that time, the Pacific Ocean. There were even rumors that there was a great undiscovered continent in the distant south, Terra Australis, not to be confused with the present-day continent of Australia. Also interesting is the fact that Captain James Cook's wife lived until the 1830s, surviving 50 years as a widow. Quite interesting that there seems to be more of a connection to someone who was a real historical figure, and yet even this lady had passed away nearly 200 years ago. So all we really have are these accounts of James Cook and many different images that show many different styles and different type of individual. Here it seems we have the Ralph Ineson version of Captain Cook. Ralph Ineson was the guy who played Theon's first officer in Game of Thrones who tried to save him from being a buffoon. In any event, many memorials and many first contacts and explorations conducted by Captain Cook, and he was quite the individual. We're going to take a look at each of the 3 famous voyages that he conducted and what the objectives of each of his explorations were. Because, as we understand it in the official history, Captain Cook is responsible for really completing the exploration of the known lands. He's credited with the full discovery and mapping of Australia, New Zealand, and an understanding of what the limits of the land were. Although his primary mission was to locate Terra Australis, and allegedly he succeeded because he verified that Terra Australis didn't exist. His first voyage occurred from 1768 to 1771, and here as we can see on this Robinson projection of what we're informed is the globe, and whatever your thoughts are on the shape of the land, we're not going to solve it during this particular exploration. I mean, Carl Sagan said that Eratosthenes did prove that the world is round, even though for some reason he didn't actually draw a full map of it. The stated mission that Captain Cook was to conduct, though, was measuring the passage of Venus across the sun. And by doing this, they would be able to interpret and learn the exact distance between the very planets themselves. Yes, this was the stated objective of Captain Cook's mission, to sail all the way from the United Kingdom or Great Britain down to the Southern Pacific. Now, other historical sources will say that this was just a cover. His real objective, once completing these measurements, was to actually find or verify if this imaginary or mythical continent, however you want to say it, of Terra Australis actually existed. And he also came across Botany Bay in Australia during this first voyage. Botany Bay? Oh no. But in any event, when he came across Botany Bay and discovering Australia, it seemed to be incidental. And indeed, his main mission, even during his first voyage, was not to measure Venus, and even though we're told through official recordings that Captain Cook and the other astronomer that was assigned to actually measure it didn't successfully measure it. And of course, we're said it was because of the limitations of equipment at that time, or perhaps they had simply made a mistake. He still succeeded in his first voyage, and he was promoted for his success. And he also discovered and cataloged some of the first known and published scholastic accounts of the existence of Australia, such as this image of the kangaroo. Now again, this is exactly what the official history tells us, and therefore his first voyage was considered a success. So you get a second voyage, and from 1772 to 1775, Captain Cook spent 3 years sailing at the southern end of the land, the southern Pacific Ocean and the southern Atlantic, attempting to verify if Terra Australis did exist. He did exclusively map out the land of New Zealand and both islands there, but as we're told, he was unable to actually locate or verify the existence of Antarctica. So quite an intriguing account. And again, this entire openly stated objective for the second voyage was indeed to confirm or deny if Terra Australis, the mythical continent, was there. Captain Cook's official account concludes that there was no mythical continent there, but he did believe that there was a continent of ice. Again, another vague, hand-waved explanation for what he really discovered. And we have all these other accounts of what his explorations actually consisted of these very unique and magical lands that had not really been contacted much by explorers prior to him. And it wasn't until his explorations that there was finally an understanding gained of what the Pacific really looked like. It should also be noted that Captain Cook acquired the services of a Polynesian navigator. Somehow a Polynesian navigator had a very good idea of navigating around the southern Pacific Ocean. What's interesting, though, is again we have a conflicting account. The conflicting account being that the Polynesian navigators relied exclusively on the stars to navigate, and yet this one particular individual that Captain Cook and his crew picked up and used for his navigational awareness of the South Pacific, he somehow was able to draw out a map that showed Captain Cook exactly where specific islands actually were located. So many interesting conflicting accounts here with Captain Cook and all of the explorations that he did. What was he really looking for, though? Was he actually looking for Terra Australis? Was he really looking for Antarctica? Was he just simply exploring as long and as fast as he could, trying to discover anything that he could? There's also an interesting series of accounts of how Captain Cook sometimes managed to relate well with the natives on the various islands that he went to, and at other times there seemed to be violent encounters. Indeed, foreshadowing that was how Captain Cook met his untimely demise, was in a violent encounter. And indeed, he has a very mixed reputation to this day. But it's very intriguing that there's all these monuments and all these locations that he visited that pays tribute to the fact that this was the individual who managed to really connect and understand what the extent of the world was. And yet this was also an individual that still had to rely on a native Polynesian navigator to find many of these locations. It's another example of the conflicted account, indeed, with the very objectives of Captain Cook's actual mission. And remember that this is the most recent of the explorations in the so-called Age of Discovery, or the Age of Explorations, where we have sailors sailing around the land and discovering new lands and achieving new maps. And if you've ever read the novel Shogun by James Clavell, he does give you an idea of what this may have looked like, especially from the perspective of Pilot Major John Blackthorne, who is the primary character in the Shogun novels. The whole concept of how important pilots were. Pilots are navigators to actually navigate the ships through unknown areas, or they had what they called their rudder, their set of instructions for what headings to sail. Here we have one of the maps that was allegedly drawn by the Polynesian navigator. And yes, of course I say allegedly because I don't know, I wasn't there, I didn't watch him actually draw it out. We also have these other series of baffling maps that depict the very southern pole of the planet, or the land, or the Earth, or whatever you want to think of it as. And it's intriguing as well because of the fact that it seems that Terra Australis was confirmed not to exist in Captain Cook's second voyage. And yet he did not officially discover Antarctica, the continent, but he did manage to come to conclusions that there was something there. He was stopped by the ice, according to his log. Now, as I'm always famous for saying, make of that what you will. We don't know the exact details, and I can certainly assure you that I was not on the voyage with Captain Cook, any one of the three, but it's very interesting reading some of the historical accounts and trying to work your way through the discrepancies. The mapping, such as the island of Georgia, and many of the other isolated and unique islands that happen to exist throughout the South Pacific and even west of Australia in the Indian Ocean. Many interesting places that we oftentimes don't talk about or think of. These are very exotic locations to this day, and we get the feeling that in many ways Captain Cook really was testing what the boundaries of the known land actually were. Now, whatever you want to say the conclusions were, or what his actual mission really was, it seems as though there was a lot of importance attributed to this individual. So I think that there are some elements of this account that seems to be rooted in our actual history. And therefore, if there is some historiosity, in other words, true historical events that transpired with Captain Cook, indeed his attempts to try to locate Terra Australis, and yet fail to locate Antarctica, but yet still extrapolate that it was down there. It seems to be a series of conflicting accounts, and remember, we're only 2 voyages into Captain Cook's exploration, because he actually had 3 voyages. And we look at the 3rd voyage, which transpired from 1776 to 1779. And we can see that Captain Cook's official mission was to find the legendary Northwest Passage, or the passage that went north of North America and enabled a rapid transition from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean, and vice versa. You might recall that in our previous explorations, many attempts to locate this northwestern passage met with disaster, especially with the subsequent Franklin expedition that occurred nearly 80 years later. During this voyage, Captain Cook came across the Hawaiian Islands, and one of his officers, an individual by the name of William Bligh, actually made these sketches and these maps. We even have accounts that Captain Cook went into the Chukchi Sea trying to locate the Northwest Passage, but he had no choice but to turn around when he came across vast blocks of ice, which is what one would expect when they're operating that far north. It's also the interesting account that during Captain Cook's voyages, here we have an image of William Bligh, who was on this particular voyage, that Captain Cook had developed an instrument that enabled the more proper measurements of longitude, or east-west distance traversed, or a ship's position fixed. So once the ability to fix latitude and longitude, a ship anywhere in the ocean could fix its exact position. We also realized that it was during the 3rd voyage that Captain Cook began behaving erratically. He seemed very frustrated by the fact that he couldn't find the Northwest Passage, and when they went to Hawaii, he ended up in a dispute with some of the islanders by kidnapping their primary chief, leading to a violent conflict, and much as his explorer predecessor, Captain Cook met his untimely demise at the hands of these natives when they killed him. They, of course, still respected his body because he's Captain Cook, and anybody knew exactly how awesome he was. At least that's what the official historical account says. So what can we really make of all this, these voyages of Captain Cook? From 1768 to 1779, 11 years of sailing all across the known oceans, trying to determine the exact extent of certain lands and locating lands that may or may not have existed. Also looking for other passages. Indeed, locating Terra Australis was something that was a known objective for many explorers. There were many legendary lands that were located at the extreme southern latitudes. And yet it should be noted that officially Captain Cook did not locate Antarctica. He was also tasked to try to locate the legendary Northwest Passage, and it was on failing to do so that he seemed to have a loss of heart. There is also accounts that he may have been suffering from sickness or some sort of stomach ailment, and this is what caused these issues. So was this really an age of discovery or rediscovery? It's very odd when we look at all these extreme locations that these explorers visited. The account of the first circumnavigation with Ferdinand Magellan, or Elcano, whoever we want to give credit for it, is very intriguing because of the fact that we're informed that historically, a polymath from Greece had actually determined the full circumference of the Earth over 2,000 years ago, but for some reason did not have a surviving map. Of course, we can attribute that to the fact that this individual, who was the chief librarian of Alexandria, lost all their works, all their books, and all their maps when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. But then we also have to consider the historical criticism with the fact that how could there be any knowledge of Eratosthenes, or however you want to pronounce his name? Because yes, it depends on which doctor, which lecturer you're listening to, much like with many other things. But what do you think was the real objective behind these missions of exploration? And do you believe we've actually mapped out the extent of all the known lands? Or are there other lands? Let me know what you think. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me.
It seems clear that in many fields, Eratosthenes was alpha. He was an astronomer, historian, geographer, philosopher.
This is absolutely fascinating.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into the Tuatha De Danann, a people of the Old World. The Tuatha De Danann come from Irish myth and legend, yet they may have truly existed. In today's exploration, we're going to examine who these people were and what their role was within Irish myth. We're also going to glean an understanding of Irish myth, and it should be noted that I don't believe that one myth or one culture's myth supersedes any other. We're just looking at Irish myth first because that's connected to earlier explorations on the channel. I will be exploring other myths and other legends from other cultures across the land, and I may spend some time doing that. The Tuatha De Danann, in Celtic mythology, a race inhabiting Ireland before the arrival of the Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish. They were said to have been skilled in magic, and the earliest reference to them relates that after they were banished from heaven because of their knowledge, they descended on Ireland in a cloud of mist. They were thought to have disappeared in the hills when overcome by the Milesians. The Book of Invasions, a fictitious history of Ireland from the earliest times, treats them as actual people, and they were so regarded by native historians up to the 17th century. In popular legend, they have become associated with numerous fairies still supposed to inhabit the Irish landscape. So we have the mythology and we have the legend. And here we have this typical debate between something that was supposedly fictitious, the Book of Invasions, and yet it's regarded by native historians as being an actual people and actual accounts. Why is it that this account of history and myth is always so clouded? Yet one group always claims that they know what really happened, and yet another group doesn't. It seems as though the real intention behind this is to cause us to question what our true history was. Or we know the reality with saying what a history is and what it really means. The Tuatha De Danann, a magical race that possessed supernatural powers. Most of them were godlike creatures or divine beings that were being worshipped. This race was also known to believe in the goddess Danu. She was sometimes referred to as the Mother, and another translation of their name is followers of Danu. The Tuatha De Danann came from 4 major cities: Pelias, Gorius, Phineas, and Murius. The whole concept of the Tuatha De Danann coming from 4 cities is remarkable. There's also further detail in the legend and the myth that the Tuatha De Danann fled from Ireland, or fled from the world, to the north for reasons unknown. The interesting thing about Irish myth is there's a lot of missing components to it. And one has to wonder why there's so many missing components when we have other myths from across the land that seem to be more complete. What interests me about Irish myth is the fact that there are these missing components, and yet, again, there's this reference from the 17th through the 19th century, a questionable time, that gives indications that this may have been something that truly occurred. The fact that legend indicates that the Tuatha De Danann went to these 4 cities, I wonder if these 4 cities could have been the 4 cities in the unknown or lost lands to the north. And I think there's a lot of validity in that theory based on what we're reading in the myth. And this is why we're going to explore the Tuatha De Danann going forward. Irish tales and mythology. We need to have a better understanding of Irish tales and mythology and why it seems to be somewhat incomplete or in a state of disarray in terms of its organization. It's almost as though that was something that was intentionally induced to make understanding these accounts, which may have a lot more basis in fact than a lot of people like to believe, difficult. Irish mythology is a vast world of legends and tales. All of them existed in the pre-Christian period, and according to some sources, they ceased to survive right after that. However, these tales are still passed from generation to generation, one after another. And we have to wonder about this statement of pre-Christian period, because going back to the film Excalibur, it almost seems as though the major religions of the world have been with us far longer than we like to imagine, and no doubt came from previous eras. The organization of Irish mythology gives us some clues in terms of why it seems the contemporary world we live in wishes to keep it in a state of disarray. It's organized in 4 primary cycles. The mythological cycle, a cycle mainly about myths and fantastic legends, and makes up most of Irish legends. And this is the world that you'll find the legends of the Tuatha De Danann. Yet they do also appear in the other cycles, most notably the Finian cycle. The Finian cycle concerns the stories of Fionn MacCool, a legendary hero and a group of warriors or military order called the Fianna, which we have covered briefly in the video about Skellig Michael. We also have the Ulster cycle. Mythological cycle focuses on supernatural elements, and this focuses more on warriors and battles. And then the King cycle, or the Historical cycle, interesting name. The cycle holds those 2 names, and most of the tales fall in this category belong to the so-called medieval period. And you have to wonder if the introduction of this particular cycle is designed to confuse the tales from the other cycles, or to question how accurate they may be. Regardless, it seems as though these cycles do give us some organization to Irish mythology, and yet many people will tell you that the reason Irish mythology is not more known in the mainstream is because it's incomplete, unlike other myths such as the more famous Greek myths, which seem to be much more well known. We're going to be attempting to fill in some of the details with these cycles and look to see how this may be a historical account or an objective factual account of what may have happened in eras in the past. It seems as though the Tuatha De Danann hail from a time between the First and Second Era, and that the real cycles that we'll be focused on, the mythological cycle and the Finian cycle, occurred specifically during the Second Era, in terms of this channel's theories on breaking down our actual timeline. The Tuatha De Danann brought fascinating skills and wisdom to Ireland when they arrived there. They gained those skills from 4 wise men who resided in the 4 cities, 1 in each. Cineas was the wise man who resided in Murius, Morius in Falius, Urius in Gorius, and Arius in Phineas. Over and beyond, the Tuatha De Danann brought 4 treasures from the 4 cities, treasures that were beneficial to Ireland. And we'll briefly look at these treasures now. We have the Cauldron of Dagda. No company ever went away from it unsatisfied. A remarkable piece of technology, and we have no idea what it really looked like, and yet there are many accounts that state that it seemed to be able to produce whatever material needs that the Tuatha De Danann needed filled in the moment. Remarkable. It reminds me almost of a matter replicator from the Star Trek series. Isn't it amazing to think of the possibility of such technology? Of course, we'll be told that it was magic or that it's merely myth. Yet, one thing I think Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction writer, was correct in stating is that to a people that encounter technology that's beyond their comprehension, then the people that possess that technology are going to appear as though they are deities, which is something fascinating to consider about the Tuatha De Danann. The most famous spear is referred to as Luge's spear. Sources claim that it was brought to Ireland from the city of Falius. The latter was one of the 4 cities that the Tuatha De Danann came from. The spear's head was made from dark bronze and it was sharply pointed at its tip. It's also remarkable how we have so many different references to spears within our so-called history. Most importantly, the spear possessed magical abilities. It was impossible to overcome in battle or to defeat the warrior who wielded it, and we have to wonder what the true nature of this spear really was. The Sword of Light, second treasure of the Tuatha De Danann. It belonged to Nuada, the first king of the race. It came from Phineas City. The sword has actually made an appearance in plenty of the Irish folktales. It plays a part in Scottish myths as well. There were several names to it: Shining Sword, White Glaive of Light, and Sword of Light. The Irish equivalent to its name is Clamansolas, or Clara Sholas. Pronunciation on Gaelic is not one of my strong points, but regardless, this sword seems to have inspired many other swords and many other legends. We have Excalibur pictured in the top right here, and the channel covered that film earlier this week. And then we have the Sword of Light, which played a critical role in the mythology or legend of the Game of Thrones or World of a Song in Ice and Fire in George R.R. Martin's works. Remarkable in terms of considering what this legend really could have been and what the sword truly was. One thing I'll note is that while it's called the second treasure, in some accounts the treasures of the Tuatha De Danann are numbered, and in other accounts they are not. Last we come to the Fall. Stone of Fall is a stone at the inauguration mound on the Hill of Tara in County Meath, Ireland, which served as the coronation stone for the King of Tara and hence High King of Ireland. It is also known as the Stone of Destiny or Speaking Stone. According to legend, all of the kings of Ireland were crowned on the stone, perhaps the same story as Stonehenge. Now we know from many accounts that the standing stones at Stonehenge were replaced and that the energy in that location has changed. This particular location is somewhat questionable because it does have the same story that goes along with it, that perhaps the stones are replaced. Nevertheless, the location itself still seems to retain the energy, and it's a remarkable account in terms of what the stone really could have been or represented to both the Tuatha De Danann and to the subsequent kings of Ireland. The High Kings of Ireland were actually members of the Tuatha De Danann originally, but the lineage from that time depends on your interpretation of the myth and the legend. The goddess Danu. Danu was the mother goddess of the Tuatha De Danann. That is why their name means the people of Danu. She is one of the very ancient goddesses in the history of Ireland. Her modern Irish name is usually Dana rather than Danu. People usually refer to her by the goddess of earth or the goddess of land. Her main duty was pouring her power and wisdom, the lands to bring prosperity. Danu possessed a lot of fascinating skills. The mythology states that she passed most of her skill to the Tuatha De Danann. As a consequence, most of the members of the race are either divine figures or supernatural beings. It's a remarkable consideration, though, that we say they're supernatural beings, and yet they had a goddess themselves. It makes you wonder in terms of what the true account is, and who was this Danu? We have numerous myths across the entire land that tell us that all the roots of our civilization came from some sort of divine intervention. Now, mainstream contemporary accounts, such as scientists and historians, will tell us that this is just myth. These were people trying to explain their origin when they had no origin story. Now we'll tell you about evolution, and that's your story, and that's all you need to know, and things possessed during the Bronze Age, and people made pyramids by floating the blocks in vast pools of water, etc. However, I think it's a remarkable consideration, though, that these types of legends and myths are what actually persist across the land, and there is consistency in them. There are many connections, and this is the first one that we're examining in greater detail. Nuada of the Silver Arm. Before the Tuatha De Danann arrived in Ireland, Nuada was their king. He remained the king of the Tuatha De Danann for about 7 years. After those years, they entered Ireland and fought the Feebolg. The latter were the inhabitants of Ireland by the time the Tuatha De Danann arrived. Before fighting the Firbolg, Nuada asked if they could take a portion of the island for the Tuatha De Danann. However, the king of the Firbolg refused, and they both prepared for the upcoming war. That was the Battle of Mog Torrid, where the Tuatha De Danann won. Unfortunately, Nuada lost his arm in this battle, and 50 soldiers carried him out of the field by Dagda's orders. Despite the loss of Nuada's arm, the Tuatha De Danann gained Ireland as land for themselves. He's called Nuada the Silver Arm because they replaced his arm with a silver arm. Isn't that a remarkable consideration in myth? Was it really just a silver arm? Of course, we'll be told that it was magic that animated this silver arm. Or was it some sort of technological component that was behind it? You have all these references to these remarkable aspects, and someone will just tell you that it's just a perspective, that you've been reading too many science fiction books and you're trying to assign these rational explanations for what may have happened in the past. And yet these references are just far too many to simply ignore, and it's what makes the Tuatha De Danann a very interesting tribe, race, people to consider, and it certainly indicates that they were an old world people. The Fomorians, a ceaseless wheel of war and peace. During the 7 years of achieving the perfect arm of Nuada, Breas was the temporary king. However, he wasn't purely from the Tuatha De Danann. His mother belonged to that race, but his father was a Fomorian. Probably his mother's origin was the reason he made it to the kingship. Nuada had to pick up where he left off. He retook the kingship, however, they were no longer as peaceful as they were. Breas seemed to be bitter about having to leave the chair, and was by all means an unpopular king, who favored the Fomorians over his people. Thus he initiated a war with the Fomorians against the Tuatha De Danann. There were also still refugees of the Furbolg around the area. They supported the war since they were enemies of the Tuatha De Danann. Balor was the leader of the Fomorians. He was giant and incredibly strong. Also, the Irish traditions claim that he had only one eye. However, that did not affect his strength. In that battle, Balor succeeded in killing Nuada, the king of the Tuatha De Danann. However, he died as well. Luj Lavhada was the champion of the Tuatha De Danann. He managed to avenge Nuada's death by killing Balor. Remarkable, this account of the Fomorians, and when we look into them, they seem to be yet another account of what's likely a corrupted group of human beings. And there are many unique details about giants, twisted creatures, and other aspects of the Fomorians who fought the Tuatha De Danann. Was this potentially in the Second Era? Was this more of a historical account or an objective account? There seem to be indications that it was. The Battle of Ventry. We alluded to the Battle of Ventry in the exploration of Skellig Michael, the great battle between Fionn McCool, the leader of the Fianna, and Dare Dawn, the king of the world. This seemed to be some sort of major event that occurred towards the end of the Second Era. And it's a remarkable account because we don't have a lot of information about who Dare Dawn, the king of the world, was. Yet there are allusions and other myths that indicate that someone existed as a king of the world. Now here I've used an old artistic picture of Alexander to represent Dare Dawn, because I believe that there's a lot of consistency in accounts, and in my humble estimation, the true objective historical account of Dare Dawn may as well be Alexander the Great, because we just arbitrarily proclaim that some things have more so-called historiosity in them than others. We're going to be exploring the Battle of Ventry in great detail, and it's an upcoming exploration to consider what it may have represented in the Second Era and what was truly at stake, especially when we consider the fact that there were accounts that Dare Dawn had conquered every land except for Ireland at the time. What became of the Tuatha De Danann? The sway of the Milesians. The Milesians was another race that existed in ancient Ireland. Legends refer to them as the Sons of Mil. In ancient times, when the Tuatha won the battle and took over, they had a deal with the Milesians. They kicked them out, but they said if they managed to land again in Ireland, the country shall be theirs. This was according to the rules of war. The Milesians withdrew and went back to the sea. Then the Tuatha raised a great storm to dash their ships and ensure their loss so they wouldn't come back. After that, they kept Ireland invisible. We have a very specific year here. In 1700 BC, the Milesians arrived in Ireland to realize that the Tuatha De Danann were entirely taking over. The Tuatha De Danann thought that they had managed to keep Ireland undetectable to the Milesians. However, they managed to find the land and marched into Ireland. The Tuatha were not prepared for resisting the Milesians, as they didn't expect them to find the land that easily. And that's the end, really, of the Tuatha De Danann. Legend indicates that they went underground, and they vanish from accounts. We don't have any more detail than that. We're also told that the Milesians are the progenitors of the people who inhabited Ireland in the contemporary era. Who knows if any of these details are true? But when we consider the overall account of the Tuatha De Danann, We see that this was a people that seemed to possess magic or a remarkable technology and had a very rich history. They also played a very decisive role in the Battle of Entry, as Fionn McCool and the Fianna were greatly outnumbered by the army of Daredon, the King of the World. Had the Tuatha Dé Danann not intervened and participated in the battle, it's very clear that the King of the World and his army would have defeated Fionn McCool and ultimately would have conquered all of Ireland and the entire world. What consequences would that have had for the old world? And what consequences would it have had on humanity today? It's clear that much was decided during this time frame. We'll be exploring the Tuatha Dé Danann and these myths more, and I will be looking at many other myths going forward. Well, thank you for joining me today. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring charts of the old world and Tartaria. I've always been someone who's enjoyed looking at maps, whether they were maps of our supposed land or realm, and fantasy maps from various forms of science fiction and fantasy, such as Lord of the Rings. One of the tropes of Lord of the Rings is you're not going to get a Lord of the Rings book without having an amazing map in it, or any of the other works of Tolkien for that matter. And yes, don't worry, we will be getting to Tolkien too. In any event, the purpose of this exploration is to take a look at some different maps and charts and determine what the difference is. We have the saying of map, and what you see in front of you could be considered a map, or could it be considered a chart used for navigation. I always found it interesting that even to this day, every government agency, in the United States at least, continues to conduct navigation off of a flat screen. It's just an interesting observation. We'll start by looking at the largest early world map from 1587. Now, supposedly this was something that had been published a little more well-known recently, but we'll look into the story that we're given behind it. It is a remarkable world map, and the mainstream does tell us that it's a world map, and it's been looked at by many mainstream and alternate research channels before. You may have seen it, but I thought I would take a look at it, and we'll recover the story behind it and then look at it holistically to see what sort of details we can glean from looking at this very remarkable work. And of course, since it's been discovered, even though it was originally just on flat sheets of paper, the mainstream has already done their typical modifications to it, putting it in different projections, and then of course my favorite, making it into a globe. Yes, I wonder how they achieved that and how many ways they had to alter it. I remember way back when I was in grade school, I think it was around third grade, where the teacher taught us that the reason that when they took maps and put them on tables, pulling them off of the globe, they had to put them on different projections, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be accurate. And she used the analogy of taking the peel of an orange and trying to put it down flat on a table. Absolutely correct. But I wonder how it would work in reverse if you took an existing map and then tried to put it around a globe. Well, it'd probably be a lot easier. Let's look into the story that we have behind this map, shall we? Let's see what they tell us about the origin of this largest early world map. Monte's 10-foot planisphere of 1587. Funny that they use that term, planisphere. I wonder if they explain that. An extraordinary 60-sheet manuscript world map made in 1587 by Urbano Monte has been added to the David Ramsay map collection at Stanford University. At 10 foot square, this map or planisphere is the largest known early map of the world. It was hand-drawn by Monte in Milan, Italy, and only one other manuscript copy exists. The digitally joined, well, that doesn't sound ominous at all, does it? 60-sheet map image below is the first time the map Monte made has been seen as one unified map, as Monte intended, in the 430 years since it was created. See all the individual sheets here. Monte's map reminds us of why historical maps are so important as primary resources. The North Polar Azimuthal projection of his planisphere uses the advanced scientific ideas of his time. The artistry in drawing and decorating the map embodies design at the highest level, and the view of the world then gives us a deep historical resource with the listing of places, the shape of spaces, oh that sounds good, and the commentary interwoven into the map. Science, art, and history all in one document. Until now, Monte's manuscript map was seen as a series of 60 individual sheets. The only assembled version is the small single-page key sheet of the series. Fortunately, they found that too. Now that we have joined all 60 sheets digitally, accomplished with great skill by Brandon Rumsey, we can appreciate in a new way the extraordinary accomplishment that Monte made. The assembled map, just over 10 feet in diameter, is one of the largest, if not the largest, world maps made in the 16th century. And how did they know that? What if there was another map made in the 16th century that didn't make it to contemporary times? Oh, well, we'll just go with what they're telling us. The degree of detail and decoration is stunning, and the entire production is surely unique in the history of cartographic representation. Monte made his map to serve not only as a graphical tool, but also to show climate, customs, length of day, distances within regions. In other words, to create a universal scientific planisphere. There's that term again. In his dedication on Tavola, he specifies how to arrange the sheets of the planisphere and makes it explicit that the whole map was to be stuck on a wooden panel 5.5 braccia square, about 10 feet, so that it could be revolved around a central pivot or pinned through the North Pole. This was never done, but now we can do it virtually. Of course, we can do anything virtually. Monte's 60-sheet world map digitally assembled into a 10-foot planisphere. It's a very interesting story, and here's the overall planisphere, and we'll do some analysis on it in a second, but I want to do a little analysis on what we're told. So we're supposed to believe that they found these 60 sheets. Where did they find them? I'd like to look into that story. Did they find them in a lunchbox in what remained of Monte's house in Italy? Did they find it inside of his toilet? Was it buried in a box in the beach that some treasure hunter found? No more detail on that, just we have these 60 sheets and there's only 2 copies in existence. And thanks to the magic of wonderful modern technology, we could scan and join these 60 sheets to make a planisphere that is still a flat sheet or a flat map. Okay, well, make of that what you will. And then furthermore, this whole concept of the fact that this is the largest map, and they just make that broad declaration. Why don't they say it's the largest map that we know of? And again, I'm playing it from the perspective that everything that we're told in history is accurate, and at least as accurate as we can believe. Of course, as we found out yesterday, when judges store historical documents and keep records in a shoebox in their office, it tends not to work so well. So I wonder what technique Urbano Monte had that he was able to preserve this remarkable map that he clearly intended to be a planisphere with poles, even though once all these sheets are scanned and put together, it looks like a very flat map to me. But fortunately, our contemporary scientists in making sure that we have an accurate understanding of what the realm looks like, because remember, it's a scientific fact. It's proven beyond any shadow of a doubt what the shape of the realm is. And yet when they put it together, they give us this flat sheet. But don't worry, they've put it on a globe. Whew, I know, you're all breathing with a sigh of relief. So anyways, let's take a look, and we'll start from the center. And isn't it interesting that in what's depicted as the North Polar region, it looks like we do have land. We have a very significant landmass there. Now, is it under the ice? Was there not any ice there? How exactly were they able to chart this? We'll have the typical explanations that they just simply didn't know what they were doing back then, or they were making extrapolations based on observations that were later proven scientifically to be incorrect. But you can see it right here. They had a landmass depicted at the North Pole. Looks like you potentially have Greenland here, North America here, Asia here, Europe right there. So it is a pretty accurate map when it's put together. I still don't know why they call it a planisphere, because it's supposed to be something representing the planet. It just seems like that's a very erroneous term. But that's just my estimation of the map, or chart if you will. And yet it seems like you have very accurate depictions of lines of latitude and longitude, so potentially you could use this to navigate with. So quite remarkable. Looking at what was still the New World at that time, as they called it, supposedly, if we go off the historical narrative, we see Florida and the Caribbean, and all the way down Isthmus of Panama connecting to South America. And when we explore down to South America, we see that they depict the Cape Horn almost connecting with the landmass that we know to be Antarctica. Although I just won't gloss over that anymore, depicting all these lands on the outer perimeter. Because when you lay these sheets flat, well, it is a map or chart that's depicted flat, that they call a planisphere. Yes, of course. And yet it seems that you actually have the main continents surrounded by rings of land. Now, could Australia be depicted? Let's talk about Australia a little bit. It's important. We don't want to forget the land down under. So, would it potentially be over here? Is this it? Did they just not know? Interesting considerations. And you have to wonder what's really being depicted in these lands in the outer portion of this so-called planisphere. It's very fascinating. And of course, that's why the modern historical and scientific interpretations will tell us that no, this is not a passageway or a channel leading to other lands. And no, this is not a flat map. And our realm is not a disk. It's very clearly a sphere. Don't make us tell you again, okay? It's been scientifically proven. Don't mind the fact that the images are very inconsistent. So in any event, take it for what it is, make your own conclusions, but it is a very remarkable map, and the overall depiction of the entire land, at least as we know or understand it, is remarkable. And depending how you interpret it, are these channels, are these gateways to other lands? Well, if you just take it literally, if you just go off of your own observations, and you don't factor in anything which you're told with preconceived notions, one could very easily make that interpretation that yes, these are channels, these are gateways to other lands. I'm just going off of what's being shown on the map. So, very remarkable, very detailed, and I think we need to look into a little more detail on each of the sections of the map. So they've provided some nice blow-ups for us, and it looks like we start right here with, looks like Africa. So we've got Cairo right here and the Nile. And very remarkable. And some of the depictions here, very clearly a camel right here. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be. Quite an amazing structure. It should be noted that he does go to the trouble of depicting towns all over the place. And isn't it interesting how this portion of Africa seems to have many towns and settlements all over it? Very well developed. Not sure what kind of creature this is. If anybody wants to let me know in the comments, it's pretty remarkable. I don't know, are we looking at some sort of dragon creature with its head upside down, or is it something else? Gigantic salamander. In any event, very remarkable. He has the pyramids depicted. 3 of them. 3 great pyramids in the Giza Plateau, supposedly. None of the satellite pyramids, of course. What's this supposed to be? Not sure. But very remarkable depiction and lots of great detail on this. So I certainly agree that this is an amazing work of art. And could it be used for navigation? Potentially. Especially with what they knew at that time. Remember, this is 1587. Well, let's take a look here. Looks like we have Northern Europe, and this is very remarkable because I featured this on the actual title of this particular video, because here you see a different layout of the land. So here we have Northern Europe, we have the Scandinavian nations, Norway, Sweden, Finland. Looks like we've got the United Kingdom over here, Britain, Wales, see, I remembered at that time, Ireland, Scotland, and yet up here we depict Greenland, and this is not how we're used to seeing Greenland depicted. It almost seems like it's very much out of position. And a lot of other lands that are between what we're told is the North Pole and the northern edge of Europe. So very remarkable. Amazing detail though, and again you have to wonder, was this accurate at the time or whenever this map was composed? Because yes, we're told it's 1587, but I think we all have our particular questions about that. And again, I still wonder how they were able to find these amazing 60 sheets. Where were they stored? What's the story behind that? But in any event, I want to focus on this a little bit, and we'll take another look at it later, because there are some connections, especially when we get back to Ireland, concerning the origin of the people called the Tuatha Dé Danann. That there was a time when they had moved north and had gone to the lands beyond. And of course, it's that dirty, dirty word that people like Harrison Pate don't like us to use because they'll call us extremists, and that's the existence of the land of Hyperborea. I don't see how referring to that land could possibly be considered extremist, but when you're in the mainstream, you have that power. You can just label anybody who disagrees with you an extremist. In any event, very beautiful depiction of Europe and the lands there, and quite remarkable. Let's move on. Now, this is really fascinating because this is supposed to be a depiction of Japan. And this is where you have to wonder, because we know this looks nothing like at least what we believe Japan looks like now, with the main islands. And this is 1587, so this was a good decade before Pilot Major John Blackthorne found his way to Japan. If anybody's ever read Shogun or seen the miniseries, it's a great miniseries from 1980 with Richard Chamberlain that depicts the historical first contact between the English and the Japanese. It's quite an amazing story. And even if it's just a fictional story, it's a very entertaining story. As for the historical detail behind it, well, who knows? In any event, what is interesting to note in this depiction of Japan is just how full of cities and development it seems to be. And while the lands don't match what we're told is the shape, you have to wonder if this is something that was put in the map because they didn't know, or was this something that was altered later to give the impression that the map was not accurate? Because we're going to believe that they assembled a map that depicted all the known lands in 1587, but we have to have reasons to question it. So, if you change the shapes of certain well-known lands, or what people know the shapes of them to be, it causes you to question the veracity, the authenticity of this map. I suspect that could be the case here, but who knows? I'm certainly open to other interpretations, and let me know what you've got. And we know what this is here, the southeastern United States. Look at that, La Florida, and then we have Cuba down here. But already some good depictions of some of the major rivers leading inland. And do we have settlements depicted? Well, it looks like we do in some places. And it's very interesting. We're told that there were Spanish settlements in Florida for a very long time, but how far in did they really go, and what was the extent of exploration? In 1587, supposedly, if we go off of the wonderful mainstream narrative, there's been a European presence in the New World, North America, for over 100 years to some extent, or not quite 100 years, but closing on it very quickly. But you have to wonder, if there were inaccuracies that were put in this map, were other portions of it more accurate? And could the land have been changed for reasons beyond our understanding or knowing? I believe that's possible as well. Again, it's another interesting consideration. And what do we have here? Central Asia. Nice horse there. What's this, like the giant bat creature? What is it with always seeing like giant bat creatures and looking at some of this? And of course, we got another giant salamander, and some of the depictions are quite remarkable. And what is this? Are these supposed to be tents? Is this depicting a horde? I mean, it's really interesting when you interpret the map from two different perspectives. You interpret it from a navigational perspective, how accurate would it be as a chart, and then you just look at its artistic aspects. And sometimes you have to wonder what's really being depicted. Quite remarkable, though, and very beautiful. Oh, I love this one over here. The giant harpy creature that's just roaming across the plains at that time. Heading back and forth from the Ural Mountains, terrorizing the populace, and yet it was just a legend. Let's see what else we've got. This is supposed to be southern Chile. Ah, yes. I'm glad they did a close-up of this, because here's where they depict Cape Horn, which we know and we're told is one of the most difficult areas to sail to this day, and yet here it's connected with this land that they considered the unknown land, terra incognita, as they called it, but what we call the Antarctica now, and where we had Admiral Byrd going down, and he kept going down just about every single decade of his life to do additional explorations, after he took a little break to fly over the North Pole. Again, some remarkable depictions, although it looks like we have animals that we're more familiar with, unless they're depicting gigantic birds that flew around and carried people off, as in legends. And while I talk about that, and I'm somewhat taking it from a non-serious tone, I think there could be something serious, though, with what's being depicted in the maps. That's something we have to consider. It is safe to say that there are numerous accounts of different sorts of life forms that may have been in our known lands, And I'm not taking that off the table, and that's something else we'll explore in the due course of time. Oh, look at this. So here it looks like you have Poseidon, who's escaped from his millennium-long imprisonment under the sea, and now he's terrorizing ships. What exactly are they showing here? Venezuela. So that portion there of South America. Again, remarkable detail. The rivers, the peoples, and again, you have settlements there. And yes, we know there were settlements. We're told that there was a previous existing civilization, according to the mainstream, the Aztecs, the Maya, and even going back further, the Toltecs, although how the heck they know that is beyond me. If somebody knows, let me know in the comments how they came to that conclusion. So just a remarkable series of details in this planisphere, as they call it, although let's be honest, it's a world map that fits on a flat sheet that you can convert to go around a globe like you can any other flat sheet. But I still wonder about its origin. Oh, what do we have here? Does anybody know what this creature is called from myth? Let me know in the comments. I'll see if anyone's a little bit more familiar with that. Although, this is very incredible. Just some of the imagination that went into this. I mean, let's just think about this. You're a cartographer in the 1580s, and you're working diligently to put together this map. And while you're being accurate with your lines of latitude and longitude and what's supposed to be a relatively newly explored land at that time, you decide to use your imagination and throw in some really interesting creatures. Look at this. Yes, he just decided to look at mythology, and he was going to throw those in to make the map look more pretty, and I'm sure that would get him additional funding from the crown, although it probably didn't work, and that's why he had to take all sections of these maps and hide them in his toilet, where they remained undisturbed for 400 years. You have to love the mainstream account. And supposedly, these are the pictures of the individuals that he was dedicating the map to, or whose favor he was seeking, because that's another theme that we get from that particular time, is you needed the favor of the royalty because they controlled all the money, and your potential prosperity in life, whether you were a cartographer, an explorer, or whatever, depended on having their favor. Yes, it makes sense to an extent, but it's a story they rely on a little too much. Quite a number of figures, so maybe he's depicting other leaders in other lands, or at least trying to give us the impression. And who knows if this was on the original map or if this was added later, because remember, this entire map was digitized and put together. And this is remarkable here because this is a very useful chart determining times of day and when you have daylight and nighttime. And that's a very remarkable and accurate scientific observation, and that's one that we can do to this day. So again, that's included with this map as well. Just so many details and so many different aspects to this so-called planisphere. I mean, really, I think there's another name for it, but there's a reason why I prefer to call it a chart instead of a map. And really, since you have accurate lines of longitude and latitude, this is a chart that you could potentially navigate with. Just watch out for the terrifying creatures that are trying to eat you along the way. And who knows, maybe there was a time when they existed. Very remarkable across the board. Now let's take a look at Mercator's map of the North Pole. And I know this has been featured on many different channels, and there's been a lot of different analysis done on this particular map. I always found it remarkable, though, that the way it was depicted with the North Pole was the magnetic rock up here. Now, there are some statements that there could be a very large mountain at the North Pole, many different names to it. The original mountain, perhaps this is where humanity originally came from, and they just simply don't want us to know that. There are numerous iterations of this map from Mercator as well, and there's one where it is depicted that the land here, where the pygmies, as he labeled them, resided, was not covered by water. And yet you see this water and you see land masses depicted around the North Pole. And that was also depicted in the so-called planisphere we just looked at. So what's really the situation there? Why is it so difficult to see the North Pole from any of the imagery that we have? Well, I'm sure there's no reason to question it. I mean, Jeremy, James, and May drove a truck all the way up to the North Pole. We know it's there, right? In any event, it's quite remarkable, though, when, again, you consider the fact that you have lines of latitude and lines of longitude. And again, this is something that you can use as a chart, potentially to navigate. And here you see this depiction of Greenland, which is a little different than what we think of it as, where Greenland seems to be more oriented west-east and not necessarily north-south, although who knows for sure. And who knows if the lands didn't change between when this map was composed and when we're looking at it. Or maybe we just don't have any idea. Because one of the questions you have to wonder is, why would anybody ever give you an accurate map of all the lands, especially if somebody has an interest in, well, controlling your movement, but not just your movement, but your perception of what things look like? It's always fascinating to me how asking simple questions and looking for simple explanations always elicits such a very extreme emotional response from some people, and I'm sure you've seen it and you've come across it. There's a reason why I'm doing this presentation with a very, how shall we say, stagnant state compared to how I normally present these videos. And I think it's just because you have to try to remain as objective as possible, especially when you're looking at something like this, because there's a reason why there's a lot of strong emotions associated with this. We're just simply looking at old maps and we're interpreting them at face value. This little island down here is very remarkable. And then, of course, we have Nova Zembala, which is supposedly where they detonated the Tsar Bomba. That was a nuclear weapon that was so powerful that the shock wave went around the planet 3 times and was measurable when it went around the planet 3 times. I believe they said the yield was 57 megatons. Of course. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed and testing slowly deteriorated after that, to the point where they were no longer doing above ground nuclear testing. Just a little historical note, but interesting when we look over here at Asia, and we know this to be Siberia today, and of course we see many settlements, and you look at the earlier maps of Mercator, you'll see that there are many more settlements depicted. I know that's been pointed out. And here you have Rus, which is Russia, which of course is definitely not a place you want to talk about too much because, well, in any event, that's where it's depicted being. And it looks like you've got the Scandinavian nations here, and just the name of some of these oceans and some of these lands are quite fascinating to consider as well. And then, last but not least, considering, it calls it right here, America, and northern Canada and how it touches the Arctic Circle is remarkable. California Regio, and we know or believe this potentially to be Alaska, but who exactly knows what's going on here? Good old Lago de Conabas, Lake Conabas, wherever that actually is. That's been the subject of many explorations by many different individuals trying to potentially locate that or explain that. It's one of those many mysteries that you have in the vast, beautiful tracts of land in Canada. But all very remarkable and a very unique depiction of what the supposed top of the land looks like, whatever the shape of it may actually be. Who knows? I haven't seen it, so I can't tell you. And yes, we have our scientific explanation, but I don't know. A lot of inconsistencies with what we're told and what we're shown, and you have to wonder why that is. Look at this. Tartaria. Very nice depiction, and we know what we're looking at here, and there's Nova Zembala right there. And then you have the rest of Siberia depicted here. Many, many different settlements and communities. And of course, if you look, especially at this tract of land right here, through modern imagery, it looks like it's been subjected to some, how shall we say, rather extreme forces of impact over time. Now, who knows what that is, and who even knows if that imagery is accurate? I always question that as well. Yes, there's a reason why I don't just defer to everything that Google Map or Google Earth shows us. I know for a fact in many cases that what they show us is not always accurate. Now, you can say it's just because it's a depiction, it's not real. Yes, it's true. But sometimes I have to wonder. But in any event, when you look at the state of the land here and just how built out and settled this all appears to be, it's quite remarkable. And yet today we're told that this is a very desolate and sparsely populated area. So who knows what ground truth reality is? Maybe somewhere in between. And another depiction, there it is again, Tartaria. There's China. I guess that's supposed to be a depiction of the Great Wall, but they're depicting Tartaria up here. And it's not Greater Tartary, which is what we recall that entry in that official historical account telling us we're mistaking Tartaria for. Yet we've seen it on 2 maps so far. And here we have another map and another depiction. There it is again. Tartaria. Not Greater Tartary. Tartaria. So that's 3 maps so far. You should play a game. See how many maps you can find where it's actually spelled out that there's Tartaria on it and just count that, as opposed to the maps that show Greater Tartary. Because remember, they can explain it away by just saying the people who made that maps didn't know what they were talking about. They were out of their minds. They were looking for the legendary kingdom of Prester John. And even though they had accurate lines of latitude and longitude, they just didn't know what they were doing. Okay? So just accept what we're telling you. And here's another one, and oh, look, there it is again, Tartaria. Although depicted now more in what we'd think of as the European portion of Russia. So I guess somebody could go along with that whole narrative that there's some Russian nationalism that's being depicted in this map. But in any event, that's where it's depicted as being, and who knows what the real situation with it is. Perhaps it's fascinating that there's so many depictions of Tartaria on maps. And there it is again. And in the same place. So, pretty much anything that encompasses this area, and my potential theory on Tartaria and why it was located on maps there is that could well have been an enclave from before the last reset. That set up and maybe even got so far as establishing their own nation. And that nation had to be destroyed. Don't know, not sure, but I certainly don't believe that the origins of Tartaria was in this area. I believe that it was a civilization that encompassed all the lands because we see evidence everywhere. For example, the often mentioned Iowa State Capitol, right here next to Shilaga. Yeah, Shilaga. Always interesting that they didn't have the Great Lakes depicted. You'd think they would have known about the Great Lakes. So one has to wonder if there were some significant changes. And of course, we'll be told, well, they just simply didn't know, so they drew it all as solid land. Fine. But you again have to wonder about it. And back on that topic of it being a civilization that was across the entire land, if you believe that there was a pre-existing civilization across all the lands, then yes, there are connections in everything that we do, from our popular culture to our movies to all of our history. So it's not just something that's isolated in its one particular area. I think there's a reason why this alternate form of research refers to it as Tartaria, and we didn't go with something like Atlantis. That's the term that it's connected with, and it is depicted on many maps. So make of it what you will. Oh, here we go. This is one of the more historically accurate maps that we'll be told, because here it's called Chinese Tartary. Not Tartaria, Tartary. Ah, yes, of course. So, in any event, as you go to the more so-called modern maps, and of course we'll be told that these are more accurate because we had more explorations and we had better science, because that's always the explanation that we're given for why we know more over time, supposedly. We're told that this is the official term. So make of it what you will. So what do we have here? We have a series of charts, maps, planispheres. We have so many different names for them, and of course we always want to give, well look, you even have greater curves depicted here on a flat map. That's quite fascinating. Where's Carl Sagan to come back to give us his explanation about how a two-dimensional creature could figure out it's in a three-dimensional realm by being able to walk all the way around the realm and end up at the point that it started in while going the same direction. Just a little problem with that, Carl, and everybody knows this. You can't walk from any spot on the known lands and walk in the same direction and end up at the spot you started at, because you either have to swim and or fly. Very unfortunate that you can't do that. It would be really cool if you could do that. I might be one of the first ones to volunteer to do that. Even if it's going to be 20, 30,000 miles, it'd be very interesting, wouldn't it? So make of it what you will. We're just looking at maps and we're extrapolating what these maps were attempting to tell us, whatever time frame they were taken in. Could these maps have been altered and changed? Absolutely, but it is an interesting exploration. As always, explore yourself, ask questions, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.